In my last video, Autoflight System Part 3, I introduced the vertical modes displayed on the flight mode annunciator and their engagement conditions. Today, we will continue with the arming conditions of the vertical modes and then proceed with the lateral modes.
Firm after crossing, turn right.
Foxtrot Delta Delta 0, wind 270 degrees 16 knots, runway 02, cleared for takeoff.
Hello and welcome back here to Aviation Easy Explained. My name is Frank Dreyer and today I continue with the FMA modes. Let's start with an overview before we look into the details. In the second line of the second column, we get the armed modes displayed. Open climb, climb, altitude, altitude magenta, altitude cruise, descent, glide slope, FMS glide slope, and TCAS armed, which will be displayed in the third row. Armed modes are identified by the blue color, with one exception, the magenta altitude mode. All modes which need a capture phase to engage in their respective final mode shown in green have an arming mode. For the acquire or capture modes, those with a star at the end, a prior engaged arm mode is a requirement to engage the capture mode. Let's start with open climb. This mode is a kind of a basic mode with hardly any requirements. Open climb arms on the ground or if SRS is engaged, but the managed lateral mode nav is neither armed nor engaged or no vertical flight plan is available. The acceleration altitude is available, which means it is programmed in the FMS and it is below the altitude selected on the AFS CP. Open climb would disarm if vertical speed or FPA is selected and engaged. How about the next arming mode, climb? Your eyes have probably recognized the difference on the FMA in the third column. NAV blue is displayed as well. How about the arming requirements for climb? Climb arms when the aircraft is on the ground or SRS is engaged, but in difference to open climb armed, NAV needs to be armed or engaged and the acceleration altitude is available and is below the selected altitude on the AFS CP and below the next altitude constraint in the flight plan 2. Well, and a vertical flight plan must be available in the FMS. All the following arm modes follow the same philosophy. They announce the upcoming mode. Alt blue is our next arming mode we are looking at. Again, we have quite a few arming requirements. Alt arms when one of the following conditions apply. Open climb engages and the altitude selected on the AFS-CP is not set to the cruising altitude. In that case, we would see alt cruise blue instead of alt blue. Or open descent engages. Or climb engages when the next target altitude is equal to the AFS-CP selected altitude but not equal to the cruising altitude. Or the next altitude target is the AFS-CP selected altitude and descent engages. Or the next altitude target is the AFS-CP selected altitude and FS-FPA engages, or the aircraft is on the ground, or SRS takeoff or SRS go-around engages and the next altitude target in the AFS-CP selected altitude plus the AFS-CP selected altitude is below the acceleration altitude. Alt cruise compared to alt tells us that the selected altitude on the AFS-CP is the same as the selected cruising altitude target in the FMS. When the capture zone of the cruising altitude is reached, alt cruise star will engage, followed by alt cruise green. Now we come to the magenta alt. Alt magenta on the FMA tells us that the next altitude target will be a constraint. Climb or descent mode is engaged and the AFS-CP selected altitude is above or below the altitude constraint. Obviously, altitude constraints need to belong to a route, i.e. they are only possible if a managed vertical profile is available. Old magenta arms, when either of the managed mode climb or descent is engaged and the next intermittent altitude target is the altitude constraint and the AFSCP selected altitude is accordingly set beyond this altitude constraint. Descent blue, the arming mode for a managed descent ahead. Let's see what are the arming conditions for this mode. The first option would be descent has been previously engaged. We are in a managed descent, but an altitude constraint star engages. Now descent green disengages and descent blue arms. The next option, the pilot flying pushes the altitude selector knob on the AFSCP provided that altitude is engaged. The aircraft is on an altitude constraint. The altitude selected on the AFSCP is set lower than the aircraft altitude. Either NAV or log star or log is engaged, and the air flight management system is either in the flight phase cruise, descent or approach. And the last option, descent, will arm again the moment alt constraint engages. TCAS blue arms when a traffic advisory has been triggered, which is not an imminent threat yet. Quick reminder, we talked about TCAS green already. TCAS green engages only when a resolution advisory is triggered. With a resolution advisory, avoidance action might become necessary. A traffic advisory does not require corrective actions on the flight trajectory, but the mode arms to get your attention. Now we come to the lateral modes, displayed in the third column. On the presentation, a quick overview. Of course, we will have a closer look to each of them and their engagement conditions. We find the same logic as with the vertical modes, namely the active modes in the first row in green color and the armed modes in the second row in blue color. Here as well, the modes with a star are capture modes with now a lateral intercept condition. This time I start with runway blue. A good check approaching the runway whether we can expect runway green later. As long as the arming condition of runway are not achieved, you cannot expect runway green once you set the thrust levers for takeoff. So let's have a look and be proactive. For runway blue, the aircraft needs to be on the ground for a minimum of 2 minutes. So in case you would fly a touch and go, the aircraft cannot fall back in runway arming conditions. The slats have to be extended and the flaps lever is not in the zero position. We need to set the ILS frequency or GLS channel for the runway we plan to take off and make sure that the difference of the ILS or GLS course is less than 2 degrees compared to the runway heading. The localizer signal has to be valid. Make sure that the localizer back course approach is not selected. The aircraft heading has to come inside 115 degrees of the ILS or GLS course. That would happen latest coming to number 1 position prior to entering the runway. And finally, the localizer deviation reaches 1 dot and reduces further. Entering the runway with runway armed, we can expect runway green after the following engagement criteria. Again, as nearly all modes interact with other modes, we find the same with runway mode. The aircraft has to be on the ground for more than 30 seconds. The slats are extended and the flaps lever is not in the zero detent. The localizer signal received is valid and the deviation from the localizer beam is less than 0.5 dot. The aircraft heading is within 20 degrees of the ILS or GLS course. No other lateral mode is already engaged. And finally, the pilot flying sets at least one thrust lever to toga. If toga has been selected on the takeoff panel of the FMS performance page, or flex MCT if flex has been selected on the takeoff panel of the FMS performance page. Runway is the lateral mode we are usually taken off with. Shortly after liftoff at approximately 50 feet radial altimeter height, runway track will automatically engage if the flight management system phase is takeoff and the nav mode is not engaged. The question is, how do we leave runway track? Well, we have three options. The first is the pilot flying pulls the heading track selector knob on the AFS-CP and heading will engage. Should track FPA have been selected instead of heading, track will engage. The second option requires that nav is armed and the aircraft approaches a capture zone of the active flight plan leg. Consequently, nav will engage. The third option is to select a direct to any waypoint via the KCCU. Again, nav will engage. We come to our next lateral mode, heading. Heading is a selected mode and not related to a flight plan. Heading is a flexible option to short-term lateral navigation. Heading will be selected by pulling the heading track selector knob on the AFS-CP. Nav, our next mode, is a managed lateral mode. Let's have a look how we get nav available for us. There are four options available. The first option, usually we take off with a flight plan route in the FMS, including a standard instrument departure. Nav was armed and runway is the engaged mode during takeoff, as I've mentioned before. Now once airborne and passing 30 feet radial altimeter height, nav will engage. The second option would take place if we are flying on a heading with an intercept track towards the flight plan active leg. Again, nav was armed, and the moment we reach the capture zone of this route leg, nav green engages. Option number 3, we are flying on a heading or track, but this time you select the direct to a waypoint via the KCCU and nav will engage. And finally, option number 4, you initiate a go-around, passing 100 feet radial altimeter height, and once the aircraft reaches the capture zone of the flight plan active leg, nav will engage. Should you have pre-selected a heading or track, then nav will not engage, as you have already pre-selected a selected lateral mode. Localizer star is our next mode, the capture mode of localizer. A few things we need to consider here as well. To get lock star engaged, guess what? You're right, lock had to be armed prior. Great, we understand this arming and engagement routine in the meantime quite well. Once the aircraft is capturing the localizer beam, lock star engages. The capture zone is inside 2.3 dots either side of the localizer. The pre-capture zone uses the GPS precision of the actual aircraft position, which is confirmed by the GPS primary message. In this case, the localizer deviation can be still more than 2.3 dots either side. From lock star, we are going to engage lock, our next mode. Let's see what are the requirements. Lock star has been engaged, and once the aircraft becomes established on the localizer beam, lock will engage. Provided lock star has been engaged for more than 10 seconds already, and the localizer deviation becomes less than 0.2 dots. The next lateral mode I would like to speak about is go-around track. A mode obviously related to the go-around maneuver. Go-around can only be initiated via the thrust levers by setting them to the toga detent. This process automatically activates other related modes. Let's look at the engagement conditions in detail. Flying a go-around generally requires to have the aircraft already in the air, but the option to abort a landing while the aircraft is touching the ground should be possible as well. For this reason, a go-around can be initiated quite late, as long as the aircraft has been less than 30 seconds on the ground. The next requirement, the flaps lever has to be out of the zero detent and the flap slats are not fully retracted. A successful go-around initiation needs to have on the A350 at least one and on the A380 at least two thrust levers set to toga detent. Important as well, neither nav nor heading or track shall be engaged. And finally, SRS takeoff is not engaged. Quite tricky as the FMA always only displays SRS in green. But in case you should have realized SRS already on the FMA beforehand, which could never happen to you in an approach, you must still be in SRS takeoff. And in that case, a go-around does not really make sense anyway. With the engagement of go-around track, SRS go-around will engage as well. Now we come to the common modes. The common modes combine the vertical and lateral guidance in just one indication. The three I want to talk about are land, flare and rollout. I will start with land mode displayed in the first row of the second and third column. Land mode is a result of a so far successful precision approach. Let's see what the engagement conditions are. Land will engage provided that GIS and LOC have been engaged before the aircraft passes 400 feet radar altimeter height and continues below 400 feet for more than 1 second. Once land is engaged, a protection routine makes sure that no inadvertent selection on the AFSCP can disengage land mode anymore. The only option for the pilots to disengage land would be the initiation of a go-around. In that case, SRS go-around and go-around track will engage, land will disengage when the aircraft approaches 60 feet radar altimeter height. Now flare mode will engage. So let's continue with the flare mode. Flare engages at approximately 60 feet radar altimeter height. Even land has been successfully engaged before, latest now the gear must be down and the slats flaps in any position other than retracted. Similar to the land mode, the pilot flying can only disengage flare by initiating a go-around. But flare automatically disengages once the aircraft touches down. The follow-up mode will be rollout. Touchdown means one landing gear touches down and the respective landing gear strut is compressed to a certain degree as to activate the associated so-named wheel on ground sensor switch. Well, and finally, we take a look at the rollout disengagement conditions. First, rollout will disengage by disengaging the autopilots and flight directors. Keep in mind that after an automatic landing and rollout, the pilot flying should disconnect the autopilots at low speed. The system logic will disconnect autopilots and flight directors latest when the aircraft exits the runway or when the aircraft track and the runway track angle differ by more than 20 degrees. The next option to disengage the rollout mode is by initiating a go-around. And the last option to get rid of the rollout mode in case the autopilots were disconnected, i.e. a manual landing, would be by pressing the approach button on the AFSCP. But rollout must have been engaged already for more than 10 seconds. And that makes sense to me. There is no need rushing while high-speed decelerating on the runway after landing just to disengage a rollout mode. Now we come to the fourth column, the first and second row, the so-named approach capability. We have 7 variants in the approach capability. 2 examples here. Cat 1, autopilot 1 is engaged and no auto thrust. And the second example, Cat 3 dual. This capability requires 2 autopilots engaged and auto thrust engaged as well. The approach capabilities are dependent on both systems status and selective procedures, but that's beyond the scope of today's topic, and I will discuss it in a separate video. Well, we finally come to an end with the FMA. To read and understand the FMA is necessary to operate the aircraft safe and efficient. A lot of incidences can be avoided by if understood what happens behind the scenes and why certain modes are displayed or combined with other modes or not available at present time. Pressing push buttons or turning selector knobs might trigger something or might trigger nothing. What the aircraft really does, you will find the answer always and only on the FMA. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I would be grateful for your feedback. If you have any questions or suggestions or other topics you're interested in, please write to me in the comment box. I'm happy if you stick with me, then please don't forget to subscribe. Hope to see you again.